I and some of my family members here live now on what we call our refuge, really. And this slide describes the land and why we hold it so close to our hearts and consider it sacred. Our land is 50 miles from here on the Poudre River, which was called the Mini Luzahan, which means the swift current, and I can tell you in June it is a very swift current. It's an oxbow of the river. It's been the home and the hunting grounds and the camping grounds for the Northern Arapaho tribe for longer than we can tell in archaeology, for thousands of years. And it was the home of the man in the top hat. That is Antoine Denis, a French fur trapper, and his wife, First Elk Woman, who was Oglala Sioux from the Red Cloud group. He was a translator for treaties, and the site also was the campground for what was left of the Northern Arapaho up until the time of the Sand Creek Massacre. So Chief Friday and his group lived there during certain seasons, and we still see our teepee rings there. Antoine Janis's descendant is Red Fawn Janis, who was imprisoned for protests at the Dakota Access Pipeline as a waterkeeper. And so that water is still flowing through her veins, and we know her aunties, and they come and visit our land and harvest willow and do other things that are sacred. So, I am a veterinarian, a dairy specialist veterinarian. I started as an anthropologist and archaeologist and farmer's child. Our farm was sold to the Nature Conservancy. It's been in our family for 13 generations. It's also on a river. So I was a landless farm lover as a young college student and put myself through veterinary college and studied agriculture and anthropology and plant exploration and everything else, and traveled around the world visiting dairy operations and other types of farming operations, and especially those that focused on traditional methods or were heavily integrated into their landscape. Our next generation is participating in farming. We call it Windsor Dairy Next Gen, and we have an Oberhausley goat mob that we graze in our forests, and we make cheeses still. I had a cheese-making license for years. We had Windsor Dairy. I married a fellow dairy veterinarian who I met over preventive medicine practices and nutrition. And we started one of the first, either first or second organic dairy farm in Colorado, worked with Organic Valley and Horizon, and then managed 800 acres of land and downsized it all to market direct to consumers with, I think, the first grass-based dairy farm in Colorado, making traditional mountain cheeses that we sold even through Whole Foods, but mostly at farmers markets. We had 1,200 members that came to our farm or our various drop points to get our food, which included many, many things, all made using traditional methods. If you could put up the biome slides, please. So Carrie tasked me, we've been members of the American Grass-Fed Association, many welfare organizations, traveled around the world working with various operations as veterinarians and advisors on nutrition. And Carrie tasked me with talking about such a tiny topic, the biome. The biome refers to everything that's alive, okay? And I'm talking about the soil, plant, animal, human interactions, which are many, and new ways and new tools we have at looking at those relationships. And I put a silly cartoon of Horton Hears a Who on there because this is how I view the biome. There are different levels. Maybe, I'm doing my slides, thank you. There are different levels at which you can view the world from the solar system to the whole planet, and all of those interact with the the larger organisms living on the planet, and all of us are fed by this amazing food chain that's the microbiome. So I am going to talk to you about the invisible part that we only saw through most of human history through its effects, through its outcomes. The miasmas and the plagues and the fantastic preserved foods that have supported humanity forever. I keep forgetting I'm changing my slides. Anyone know who this guy is? It's not. He's next. Trevor, you know who it is. Where's Trevor? It's Mechnikov. So, when did we first start to see these little animalcules, these tiny microorganisms? We did when von Leeuwenhoek had the first microscope. But who was the first one to really understand how they were interacting with us and our food? It's Elie Mechnikov, who was a zoologist from Moldavia, an area of conflict now. He did pioneering work in immunology. He was the first to see macrophages and white blood cells and understand how they interacted in our immune system. And he and Paul Ehrlich, who invented the first vaccines and started the institutes in Germany, were awarded the Nobel Prize in 1908. He was born in 1845. That's a while ago. He understood, because of his upbringing in Moldavia, that cultured milk products had an effect on the immune system, and he could see them now for the first time. And because of his work, the first cultured yogurt products were sold in Europe, and Group Danone started from them, and they are still the preeminent group. I've worked with them on some projects in looking at the microbiome and milk oligosaccharides and things like that and how they affect the health of our guts. So he was a true pioneer, and now people would not understand him as a hard scientist, but he was a hard scientist who saw at this level what was happening in our bodies. And as many, many scientists did, when a cholera epidemic came around and people were dying from it, he was able to culture cholera in his lab, and he took a drink of it and didn't even break a sweat because his gut was so healthy. Here's Louis. So all of this is, I love the history of medicine, and I use a lot of the traditional techniques in my practice. These are stories that come, for example, from a book called The Microbe Hunters, and I highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in the microbiome. It tells you a lot about how we learned all this and how it affects how we see everything now. So he was, like many people, a pharmacist, a chemist, a microbiologist. He, of course, is known for inventing pasteurization. You can boo and hiss, but it also has its purpose. For seeing disease as caused by organisms rather than the weakness of the host, which other people really emphasized. And for inventing and developing the first rabies and anthrax vaccines. So this is the start of when we started to see the microbiome as the denizen of evil, of where the pathogens come from. This is the veterinary view. Was that the right slide? I was not on the right slide, thank you. Can you beep for me and I'll change it? All right, that was Louis. Who's this? No guesses? What's on the bread? Penicillin. Apparently they didn't find it first on bread, but they grew it on bread during the war. So Alexander Fleming, Scottish scientist, he was doing the first lab experiments, growing out various pathogens, and he discovered places on the dish, the Petri dish, which we still do now, that were called zones of inhibition, and he didn't know where they were coming from. And one was a saliva contaminant with lysozyme, which is a potent gram-positive antibacterial factor in foods, not just dairy products, but other products. And then the same thing happened to him again, and he realized that penicillin bacteria, Penicillium rubrums, the spores had spread onto the plates, and they were inhibiting the pathogens he was growing. And this is the first true antibiotic, okay? Where did it come from? It came from the environment. It came from cheeses and breads and foods that we've been making forever. Who are these guys? Any guesses? They were in the middle of a controversy. Ow, thank you. You guys are good. Thank you. Okay, these guys won the Nobel Prize. It's William Campbell and Satoshi Amura. This comes from a period of time where we were out somewhat through commercial motivations doing the first prospecting of the soil microbiome. And companies were out there looking for organisms that had effects that could potentially be antibiotics. They discovered a streptomycete in Japan in a soil sample that became ivermectin. Ivermectin I used to carry with me everywhere when I traveled in developing countries and worked there, and give it to people and pour it on the backs of cattle if they were in, intensive pathogen pressure situations and parasite situations. Now I use other methods. But those streptomycetes in the soil, every single one of them produces antibiotics because there's a war on in the soil and they're all inhibiting each other and encouraging each other and all sorts of things go on. And they have little cassettes of genes that they pass on in between these organisms in the soil, and those can be incorporated, their resistance genes can be incorporated into the beneficial organisms and other organisms we interact with on our farms. So the microbiome was a hot new area. I've always been interested in new ways of looking at things, new lenses. When we sold our farm, because we became surrounded by development, which you may have seen around here. And again, I was a homeless farmer. I worked as the chief scientist for the largest colostrum company in the world, so I love colostrum. It has so many, many, many benefits and natural ways of modifying pathogens and supporting good growth in the gut, so I was able to do a tremendous amount of research on that. And during that work, we worked with Microbiome before the FDA shut them down, and measured some of the first fecal microbiota from people consuming various products. So we could see actually which groups at various levels of bacteria and fungi and viruses and other organisms, protists, which pathogens, which beneficial organisms were present in the guts of people consuming various foods, just like we had done for years in our nutrition practice with ruminants. So using the diet to alter the health of the rumen, we found similar things happening in the health of the gastrointestinal tract of humans consuming plant and animal products from the world. It's the way we interact with the world, right? The gastrointestinal tract. Of course, there are many, many other biomes, other niches on the body that interact with our food. And the estimate is there are 1,000 times more genes in your gut microbiome than there are in your body, in your DNA. That's a lot of genes that are doing a lot of support for you and for our animals. And it's part of a system. And I just want to mention here microalgae. This is a huge area of research, one I love very much, that lends itself well to on-farm production, towards lowest in the food chain kind of capture of sunlight into the vitamins that we need and the proteins that we need. And there are traditional farming systems, especially in Mexico, where freshwater microalgae and macroalgae are harvested as a protein source and incorporated into the traditional diet. I want to point out one more thing. Does anyone know what the right side of the slide represents? Doesn't really matter, but it shows mitochondria. It shows various cell organelles. It represents within your cells, within all mammalian cells, and even other animal cells, that we have microorganisms that are endosymbionts. They became part of our cells, even though they have their own genetic material. You've heard of mitochondrial DNA testing for genetics? That's because it was a free-living organism that has its own genetic code that, oh my goodness, I'll never get there, that took up residence inside our cells. Okay, so how do we get exposed to these things? How do we? As humans, we think of the uterus as a sterile environment. It's not. Now we know a whole bunch about how microorganisms affect us in utero and create long-term changes. It's a level even beyond epigenetics. Breastfeeding, passing through the birth canal and breastfeeding are our first exposures to microorganisms. Why does this matter? Most people now are getting gram-positive antibiotics given to them during the birth process in hospitals, women that are giving birth, to prevent Streptococcus septicemia, which I've treated in neonatal foals. It's a nasty disease, but it's very rare, and they wipe out the gut microbiome of those mothers, and they wipe out the vaginal microbiome. And we know from research in baby calves that the timing of when you get your first exposure to these organisms will dictate what your gut looks like the rest of your life. So this is a story of diversity versus sterility and the challenges that we face and how old ways of doing things are beneficial for keeping our diversity. So I want to say a couple things here, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Just like cattle and other mammalian species, human milk is incredibly diverse in its oligosaccharides that support the growth of the different microbiome. And so every person, every lactating animal, I should say, has its own innate and inherited predisposition to grow certain microorganisms. And the slide in the lower right is really important. It's about bifidobacteria, which are the first ones we get, and they are tightly associated with the health of our aging process. And dairy products and other plant products support those bifidobacteria. What happens when your gut's developing? It's been looked at as it's a multi-tiered system. What you end up with depends on what you're first exposed to and what your substrate is in your gut, and it can turn into a coral reef or a rainforest. It only matters how diverse it is. What does that? In the bottom right corner is the mucus production, which is phenomenal. It is the soil or the ocean for our gut. And our mucus production establishes the lowest layer in that really complex system. So how does this play out on other levels? Obviously, we all know about soil and plants and livestock and cycling of nitrogen, but also cycling of microorganisms. Really important. And in my infectious disease work, we found that on the global scale, these organisms are also circulating, and they're blown every year off of the great deserts and affect the respiratory pathogens and the beneficial microbiota that we get. So, climate, the whole planet affects our microbiome, for better and for worse. Wildfires, as we all know. The ocean, really importantly, and I did a little research on this, has a biofilm on the surface that actually has the first step in the photosynthetic process. I'm going to go faster. So where we break those cycles is where our farms break down. I'm going to describe the microbiome a little from my personal experience, because we were developing these tools as I was wandering around the world, visiting farms. This is one of our family's homelands. This is the Northern Islands of Scotland. Oh, thank you. There's your dust storms, okay. Here's the northern islands of Scotland and the seaweed-eating sheep. These sheep live on seaweed for most of their lives, and they have protists, ciliated protists, in their rumen that help them break them down. Why is that important now? There are people doing research on seaweeds and their effect on methane production by ruminants. The other part of my heritage is from the high mountains. We have brown Swiss cows, we have Oberhausley and Toggenburg goats. I had the pleasure of living there for a while during the pasture season and seeing the diversity of pastures, studying some of the effects of those pastures that are tasteable and measurable chemically in the cheeses, in the high mountain cheeses. Turns out those same umbellifers and some of the other plants these guys are grazing on are also influencing methane production. And now we can find there are available proven derivatives of these plants that can be added into the diet of our animals to decrease methane production. Near and dearest to my heart are these microorganisms. On the right is an Iron Age village that I helped build and live in. Beep, thanks for the beep. And I learned as I became a cheese maker myself and got my cheese making license that you can't vacuum pack things and coat them in paraffin and expect the whole process to take place. And I learned, how much that affinage affects the cheeses. We started our operation with cheese shelves from another local cheese producer. We used as much as we were allowed wooden products that would transfer the way microorganisms. The cheese itself is a whole ecosystem, and that ecosystem, so it has chains of biochemical processes and different organisms that take over at different stages in the aging process, and that includes the rind microorganisms. The most important thing I think you guys need to know is that some of the lactobacilli in those cheeses also grow in the muzzles of cows, in their sebaceous glands. When they graze, they're actually plant shoot stimulants, and you can buy lactobacilli that do that and use them as plant inoculants or soil inoculants. Or you can spread whey on your fields, or you can let your cows graze and apply them directly to the fields. The cheeses you produce in your creamery, if you have a truly closed loop system, have non-starter lactobacilli, they're called, that come from that whole link. They're on the farms, they're on the soil, they're on the plants, they're in the creamery, they're in the storage. And one of my questions is, can we become like ruminants? How does living your entire life intimately, with your ruminant livestock affect you? And Trevor is going to work with me on a project, he just doesn't know it yet. Looking at the gut microbiome of people that live in this way and that produce their cheeses. When I got my microbiome tested, it was in the top 95th percentile on diversity. I eat fresh things from the garden and ferment vegetables and drink raw milk and all those terrible things. And the interesting thing, and I've always been what I call an easy keeper. My last name is Cattell. It does mean cattle. Turns out that the vast majority, and I can't show you this because Ubiome got shut down and their database got shut down, the vast majority of my microbiome comes from ruminants. They're Ruminococci, Lactobacillus, Prevotella, all the rumen microorganisms. And that makes me more able to do what do ruminants do so well? Turn what into what? Fiber into protein and vitamins. Okay. Where else can we insert those microorganisms into the system if we don't have a closed system yet? Silage inoculants, soil inoculants. All of these inoculants can affect our whole localized biome. And silage inoculants are really, really fascinating, and guess what most of them are? Guess what? Who knows the name of a silage inoculant organism? Anyone? well, the ones I'm thinking of are lactobacilli, Lactobacillus rhamnosus, Lactobacillus plantarum. These are the same organisms that are circulating in that system. And they're there for the same reason as we're making these fermented vegetables, right? We're letting the lactobacillus that was on the really fresh vegetables do its work of fermenting and stabilizing the population that's in that little ecosystem. I don't know if any of you know this, but did any of you hear about COVID and the distribution of symptoms? Anyone? Eastern Europe had far, far less morbidity and mortality, and it was strongly associated with the consumption of lacto-fermented vegetables. Sounds like Mechnikov drinking his cholera juices. There they are, lacto-fermented vegetables. No one beeped, come on. Okay, what are the other organisms that we've eaten forever that are food preservatives? Two of the biggies. I've spent time in Japan on farms. They feed natto to their dairy cows. They make it every day in a pot. Okay, natto is Bacillus subtilis. It is a soil microorganism, it's a gut microorganism, and it's a fantastic natural antimicrobial. And it's right there. The other one is koji. If any of you experimented with koji on various foods, it's an aspergillus. It came from straw. It came from how we, just like our wooden cheese forms, straw mats are preserving these organisms, and they live in the environment just like sourdough yeast do. Okay, this is our farm where we press cider. I really wanted to just show you. It's a really, really old farm. It was grew apples when that were shipped in a horse-drawn wagon up to Fort Laramie. What I want you to see is what the white surface of those apples is. Who knows what it is? It's yeast, yeah, that's bloom. And so we can make fermented cider. This is how we ended up owning our farm. I used to come down the canyon after cross-country skiing or whatever and drink fermented cider. And the 96-year-old man we bought the farm from, who was the son of the fur trapper, third owner of the land, told me when we signed the contract, he said, "You know those college students, you gotta watch out for them. They come down and get drunk on the cider." Okay, we also have lots of wasps. Anyone know what wasps do to fresh cider? They carry acetic acid fermenting microorganisms, so they make vinegar. This is gonna be super quick. I've worked with swine, poultry, the biggest producers and the smallest producers in the world. And the biggest problem with swine is we keep them in a sterile environment. I have 1 minute. And they have a denuded intestinal tract, and they die on a regular basis from being starved of soil microorganisms. We keep orchard pigs. They eat apples and pumpkins. We did. And their favorite place to be is with their nose below the dirt. I worked in my colostrum job making products that were medical foods that were natural, that could heal people from various diseases. Clostridium difficile, we came up with a solution for that was microorganisms. And it's a denuding of the intestinal tract from the use of antibiotics. Diversity is everything. That's our pasture in the upper right. Beep, bop, beep, that's our diversity. The first thing we saw happen on our farm when we went organic 20 years ago was the change in the dung beetles, the change in the grass. And I want to just acknowledge some of the most important influencers in my life. Anyone interested in cheeses needs to watch the video called The Cheese Nun about Sister Noella. Has anyone seen it? Yeah. This lady wanted to make cheese. She was a nun, and her mother superior said, "Go get a master's degree." And she went to travel to France and went to all the traditional cheese aging caves and isolated the microorganisms that were growing on the rinds, and each had its own niche. Each cheese was unique because of those beneficial microorganisms, right? Remember penicillin? Penicillin candidum? What is the French paradox? It's fermentation. Pascal Bowder is a friend of mine, and he's doing the same thing with wild fermentation. There's a guy here in the audience who is, I told him he's one of my heroes. He didn't like that very much, but he is, because he's still out there doing it. He's a microbiome explorer, Trevor Warmdahl. He goes and visits dairy operations all over the world and looks at their traditional practices, and he has some tremendous insights. And one of them is, just like me, he's not afraid of the microbial world. Gary Nabhan's doing the same thing. He's now preserving not just plant species that support us and ecosystems, but even the microbial element of the ecosystems. And there's a lot of really good stuff coming in the microorganism world, and I don't have time to talk about it, but there are purple bacteria that can affect our whole agricultural system beneficially. They can do 4 different methods of metabolism. And this is super exciting, especially for my kids who are foragers and herbalists, and will be the next generation. The Wild Biome project is a project going on with foragers in the UK, and they're living only off foraged foods, and they're measuring the effects on their microbiome. Exciting stuff. Exciting stuff. And finally, if we can ruminate to a certain extent, can we also photosynthesize? The answer is actually yes. These snails that you've probably heard of actually consume and take up chloroplasts so they can make energy from light. Humans can actually do this now. It's been discovered. There's some publications showing that you can take up chlorophyll from your gut, and it actually has an effect and links to your cellular respiration. And this is the final one. I've been very, very excited about closing the loop, getting lower and lower on the food chain. How will we support more life on Earth? By gardening at every level, right? By gardening the biome, by cutting out all the intermediaries in our food chain, or at least having that food chain be very healthy. The best way to close that loop is to have photosynthesis and mitochondrial respiration happen in the same place, whether it's in your guts, in your cow's stomach, which we can do, or even within a cell. And I put this slide on, and then Monday I was reviewing it, and there was a new publication showing the first chloroplasts in mammalian cells. And it wasn't by injecting them. It wasn't by, brute force. The way they made it happen was they fed chloroplasts, plant photosynthetic organelles, to the mammalian cells, and the mammalian cells ate them. And they were functional for a few hours. That's the future. The future is integrating healthy gardening in every single part, every element of our food chain. And I'm done. Thanks.
Meg, thank you so much. And we are intentionally pushing you so we can take one question.
Oh,
so,
wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
We like to let the audience
that's
interact,
generous.
even though this was a very interactive performance or
Anyone?
presentation. One question. Who's got it? Right up there. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for that. That was really amazing. I am really passionate about this because I have so many food sensitivities now. I can no longer have garlic and onion. I don't have the right enzymes anymore to process them, and I can't have it at all. And that just happened 3 years ago, and I know it's connected to the soil microbes and our gut. So I'm wondering, for people like me, what can we do to kind of build that back up?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something we actually worked on because in my science job, because our first product was to treat children dying of diarrhea and dehydration in developing countries, and we did studies in Central Africa and the Philippines and all over the world, and we were able to alter their gut microbiota with a shelf-stable product that cost all natural, that costs less than a visit to the village doctor. From there, we worked with all the big institutes that study gut diseases. But our product got adopted when we launched it in the United States. In other countries, it was used for that purpose. But it got adopted by people with IBD and people with chemotherapy-induced diarrhea and people with just chronic intestinal problems and symptoms. And they actually adopted our product and made us repackage it so they could use it every day. There are definite ways to support your gut. I know you do know that not everyone digests milk, and I'm sorry I talked only about milk, but that's one of my perspectives, only one. But you know that lactase persistence is what makes some people able to consume milk. So that's the enzymes are still present genetically to allow you to digest the lactose without it fermenting in your gut. The same is true for enzymes for other foods. So there are genetic predispositions. If you love this stuff, you need to read a book called Why Some Like It Hot. It's about the co-evolution of people and their foods. But we're co-evolving over generations in our regions and our niches, which are now all intermixed. But we're also, our guts evolving during our lifetime. So you can change it, despite whatever your genetic predisposition is, by slow introductions of foods, but mostly by building up the microbiome, again, from the bottom up. And there are a lot of ways to do that. What would I recommend to you? There are healing diets that, well, I don't know how many of you ever read The Maker's Diet. Did anyone read that? The guy who started the whole industry of probiotics, Jordan Rubin, had gut problems. And he finally discovered that he needed to eat whole foods like we all eat, and that he needed soil microorganisms as probiotics. And guess who those are? All those streptomycetes that we were talking about. So there are probiotics that can help, but they're the main, more important in all the probiotic studies, more important than having access to the probiotics, is having access to the substrate that those microbes consume. They will not colonize otherwise. There's a lot in the literature. I can talk to you more about it, but it's a rebuilding process from the bottom up.
Thank you. A round of applause for Dr. Cattell.